The motion before the House is, this House believes it can't happen here. And I now look to the first speaker, Henry Screaton, Secretary's Committee, Magdalen College, to begin the case for the proposition.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm greatly honoured to have the opportunity to speak in this place in this significant debate. Let us note this Chamber's role in the consistent and robust challenging of authoritarian regimes and leaders. It has been shown to be a place where the resolve and independence of its speakers in advocating for freedom of expression is triumphed. Tonight, the proposition will show that such space for free expression and dissent is inherent to the British system of government and British society more generally, as well as across the Western world. The British Constitution is not invulnerable. What it is, however, is durable. Our constitutional order has survived largely unchanged since 1688 and has only seen people's freedom from authority increase. Although this is a debate about the present and the future, I think that is a fact worth noting, and we must hold on to it throughout the debate. The burden on the proposition tonight is not to defend President Trump or the British government. Indeed, last week's no confidence debate showed that such a government woefully did not have this House's support. Nor is it to defend the far right or claim that authoritarianism can't happen here simply because it doesn't exist. The far right does exist in the West, and its threat is constant and undeniable. What is equally constant and undeniable is that how our political culture combats and rejects it. You will see tonight that the proposition's case is one of reason and hope. The opposition's is one of extremes and disorder. I will address three main points in my speech tonight. Firstly, I'll look at our institutions of government and public life and show that these decisively do not welcome and propagate authoritarianism. Secondly, I'll display further how our society and discourse have not been and are not authoritarian. I will demonstrate Britain's and other liberal democracies' proud history of standing against authoritarianism. More than this, the public's firm responses to acts of authoritarianism only seem to grow as time goes on. And finally, not only will I show that authoritarianism, both institutional and societal, will not happen, but that our confidence, our hope in our Western way of government continues and will continue into the future. The biggest danger to such hope will be shown to be the over-exaggerated gloom which will dominate the speeches of the opposition tonight. Before I begin showing that we can have cautious optimism for the survivability of our democracy, it is my great privilege to introduce to you the opposition speakers for tonight. First, you'll hear from Jansu Agurulu, a second-year experimental psychologist at Pembroke College and a fellow member of the Secretary's Committee of the Oxford Union. On Thursdays, I more often see Jansu zealously jumping queues and downing drinks at breakneck speed. So, considering how her life descends into chaos and disorder, I can understand why she speaks in opposition tonight. Secondly, Professor A.C. Grayling, a renowned author and philosopher. When you hear that he has not only been offered but accepted several invitations from the Cambridge Union, you can see why I think his mind's in the wrong place tonight. Having read his recent book, Democracy and Its Crisis, I can only think that the reason why he argues in opposition tonight is that he partially welcomes the suppression of voices and the unity of correct thought under a less democratic system. Concluding the argument for the opposition is Michael Abramovitz, president of the Freedom House and former national editor of the Washington Post. Having also looked at Freedom House's yearly analysis, I'm shocked to see him arguing for an increase in authoritarianism, especially in Britain, when such analysis shows the unshaking democratic resolve of our political culture and institutions. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, these are your opposition speakers, and they are most welcome. Now, the patterns of an authoritarian leader are well documented and studied. A single figure builds up a cult-like status and breaks rules by surrounding themselves with loyal backers. They then rig the status quo and undermine checks and balances in their favour. So immediately, British and American institutions come into conflict with this. For all its criticism that 30% of the House of Lords, 785 members, are not affiliated to a political party. And as well as this, It's a body of tested policymakers, meaning that it is near impossible to control by any Prime Minister. In the US, members of Congress have shown their ability to be independent from President Trump and even stop some of his policies in their tracks, exemplified by the late John McCain and more recently in relation to Syria. In his book, Democracy and Its Crisis, Professor Grayling specifically criticises the lack of free will of our MPs in the face of party whips. As a result, you might think that Boris Johnson's recent threat to expel MPs who vote against no deal is a sign of an authoritarian rule by those whips. What about the result of these threats? 21 MPs chose to abandon their party whip and almost all hope of ministerial office. This is not a sign of the PM's personal strength, but his own MP's autonomy. Boris, as president of the Oxford Union, may have been able to subject union hacks to all kinds of malign practices without dissent, but he faces a slightly greater challenge coercing MPs. And so, the Brexit saga has shown nothing, if not the freedom of speech of our MPs. Another charge against our institutions is the supposed impotence and bias of our judiciary in the face of prerogative powers. But once again, haven't we seen in 2016 and 2019 the Supreme Court's ability to temper and regulate the executive's powers? When accusations of authoritarianism are levelled relating to press, judiciary and government, we so easily see the disturbance, but are much slower to realise the response. We see the invasion of phone hacking, but not its total rebuke following the Leveson inquiry. We see attacks against our judges as enemies of the people, but not the subsequent outrage from all sides, and many newspapers' avoidance of such language in the future. And we see Boris Johnson executing a constitutional coup by proroguing Parliament, but not the Supreme Court ruling that move null and void and placing sovereignty in our elected representatives. Therefore, Western institutions are not only inhospitable to authoritarianism, but, with our support, they actively combat it. As an apparently competent student of history, I think it would be useful to see whether British society has tended towards authoritarianism in the past. In 1931, in the depths of the Depression and a crisis of faith in government's care for the people, the proto-fascist New Party polled just 0.2% of the vote. In 1936, 3,000 fascists demonstrated in the Battle of Cable Street, and 20,000 anti-fascists stood against them. When authoritarian parties and figures arise, such as the BNP in the 2000s and UKIP more recently, that we do not engage in suppression and underhand tactics, but open and robust debate, is a sign of the vibrancy of our politics and popular resistance to authoritarian movements. The opposition might talk about conservatives pandering to the far right or Labour to the far left, but this ignores the explosion in membership for parties like the Lib Dems and the arrival of a godlike messiah, Rory Stewart, in defence of broad church parties. Voters are treated like malleable sheep by those opposite, as if all but an educated few from this glorious university, and perhaps the other place, are unable to withstand a populist allure and trickery. For instance, the opposition may focus on a report by the Hansard Society, apparently showing rising support for authoritarian government. Yet this report also showed confidence in many of Britain's other democratic institutions. The need for a strong leader was out of frustration at a lack of progress, something which, yet again, Freedom House notes as a sign of an illiberal democracy, not a liberal one. The crucial mistake that this side will not make is the oversimplification of the average voter. The simple, ultra-xenophobic Leave voter or the die-hard Trump fan are quickly swamped by Leavers for a deal and the reluctant Republicans for Trump. It is not appropriate either to attack people with genuine concerns ad hominem, or to misunderstand their often justified sources of anger, or even to not engage in civilized and open debate. And how can I be so confident about the future lack of authoritarianism in voters' minds? Take note how, when Trump scapegoated immigrants during the 2018 midterm elections, moderate Republicans deserted him at the ballot box. On our side of the Atlantic, realise how between 2015 and 2017 the UKIP vote plummeted, whilst Brexit Party voters this year voted on a single issue, not as part of an authoritarian front. In fact, the over 50% who voted for the Lib Dems and the Brexit Party voted for one thing: clarity, not a list of authoritarian policies. Even the most dyed-in-the-wool Tories on the Oxford Union Committee would have intense difficulty of explaining what Boris Johnson actually wants, be that from the EU or maybe in his personal life. So, if there ever were such a thing as peak authoritarianism, we've already passed it. The result of the political earthquakes of 2016 is an increased sensitivity for non-metropolitan issues, not a rise in authoritarianism. As I have explained, not merely the institutional freedoms, especially in the UK, but society's historical and consistent resistance to authoritarian movements together make Western democracy so resilient. Now, let us try to sketch the future and show that authoritarianism won't happen here. I'm moving back to Michael Abramowicz's again. Michael Abramowicz's own Freedom House reports from 2003 to the present have shown the UK to be in the freest tier of all main categories, be that in its freedom rating, its civil liberties, and its political rights. Moreover, the only recent changes in our overall rating have come from the ineffective exercise of government in Westminster and Stormont. Our media, judiciary, and legislature score in the highest level of freedom. Any slip in these areas should be a concern. It helps no one, and certainly not the maturity of our debate, however, to suggest that such a commanding score is a sign that Britain has, or will soon be, consumed by an authoritarian menace. And this is all during what the opposition will call a constitutional crisis. In addition to one of their studies seemingly supporting the proposition tonight, two of the opposition speakers majorly contradicted each other in the past. The second speaker has claimed our free press is under attack. The third's 2019 study stated that, and I quote, "The media are lively and competitive and espouse viewpoints spanning the political spectrum." Central to tonight's debate is whether we consider the events of 2016, Trump and Brexit, to be extraordinary and eye-opening or apocalyptic and damning. Rather than immediately seeing chaos, see how, faced with a crisis that threatens to tear apart our union and way of government, Parliament, the Supreme Court, individual MPs and protesters have resolutely defined their roles in democratic discourse. They have shown that the power of no government or individual is above the law. There is nothing new about the alarmism of the opposition, and to be honest, some of it is welcome. Being alert about threats to our constitution is no bad thing. Being defeatist and hyperbolic is where the real danger lies. The key issue which I would like you to consider is that of confidence, of hope. These words are Professor Grayling's. Confidence in reliable institutions and practices of government, populated by constitutionally constrained operators of them, voted in and votable out by the enfranchised, would lower the political temperature of society in the required way. Tonight, I would ask you to see that hope is not only something we must all have, but something which remains and will remain in our institutions and society. This is not some blind hope. When my grandma and her family fled Poland in 1939, they fled an invading country and a defending power whose institutions largely welcomed authoritarian rulers and whose societies had lost hope in democratic government. They found the UK not in a lucky draw, but because, despite errors in the past, it demonstrated and never stopped demonstrating that anti-authoritarian government, a free press, and a public increasingly opposed to authoritarianism flourished there. Therefore, with the knowledge that we can still have hope in our democratic institutions and that our societies can be hopeful in our democratic way of life, I ask you to choose reasoned optimism over despondency and doubt. Know that a vote for the proposition tonight is not some naivety or delusion of grandeur. It is an expression of your thoughtful evaluation of our democratic system. Vote yes, confirm your sureness in our courts, in our free press, in the durability of our system, and in yourself and myself as voters. So vote yes tonight. Thank you.